If you were to judge the health of a nation solely by the balance sheet of its government, Japan would appear to be a financial paradox. It is the most indebted developed nation on the planet, owing more relative to its economy than the United States, France, or the UK combined. But to compare Japan to Greece or Venezuela is a fundamental category error. Greece went bust because it owed money in euros it couldn't print. Japan owes money in yen, which it prints at will. The Japanese state is not insolvent in the way a company or a household goes broke. It cannot run out of its own money. Instead, it faces a more insidious threat: currency debasement. Japan will never default on its bonds, but it might eventually pay them back in yen that are worth less than the paper they are printed on. It is a country that once spent decades paving rivers and building bridges to nowhere, but that stereotype is now dangerously outdated. Today, Japan's debt doesn't defy gravity because of concrete. It defies gravity because of care. The drivers of the modern deficit are not construction projects, but social security, pensions, and healthcare for the oldest population on Earth. Japan is not borrowing to build, it is borrowing to exist. Just across the Tsushima Strait, South Korea presents the image of a model student, though the cracks are starting to show. While its government debt is still lower than other advanced economies, the era of the tight fiscal ship is ending. Haunted by the ghosts of the 1997 Asian financial crisis, the nation once swore a blood oath never to lose its economic sovereignty again. But today, even the state is beginning to borrow heavily to prop up a slowing economy. On paper, the Japanese state is broke, and the Korean state is rich. But the gap is closing. But economics is not just about the state. If we zoom in, past the Ministry of Finance in Tokyo, past the Bank of Korea in Seoul, and into the bank accounts and living rooms of the average family, the picture flips completely. It is a perfect, almost eerie, mirror image. The Japanese household sector is sitting on a mountain of cash, a collective hoard of over 2 quadrillion yen, mostly safe, liquid, and debt-free. In aggregate, they are the rich citizens of a broke country, insulated by a fortress of savings. Meanwhile, the average Korean household is leveraged to the hilt, carrying one of the highest household debt burdens in the world. They are asset-heavy but cash-poor, trapped in a unique rental casino called Jeonse that forces them to bet their life savings on the housing market just to secure a roof over their heads. This is the story of two economic miracles that took opposite paths. It is a story of how Japan nationalized its economic risk to protect its people, and how Korea privatized its risk to protect the state. It is a tale of the closed loop versus the Villa King. And as we stand in the mid-2020s, both of these divergent models are facing their own existential reckonings. To understand the magnitude of this inversion, we must first look at the raw numbers. The divergence is not subtle, it is structural. In Japan, the government acts as the sponge, absorbing the debts and deficits to keep the social fabric intact. In South Korea, the household acts as the engine, leveraging itself to drive growth and housing stability while the government stays lean. Japan's citizens are creditors to their own government. Korea's citizens are debtors to the housing market. But how did two neighbors, with such similar cultural roots and economic trajectories, both rising from the ashes of war to become industrial powerhouses, end up with such diametrically opposed financial DNA? To answer that, we have to go back to the moment the Japanese miracle stalled. To understand why Japan looks broke, we have to confront the number that scares every orthodox economist: 235%. That is Japan's debt-to-GDP ratio as of 2025. For every dollar the Japanese economy produces in a year, the government owes roughly $2.35. This did not happen overnight. It wasn't a single catastrophic war or a sudden collapse. It was a slow-motion accumulation of cement, stimulus, and silver. When Japan's massive asset bubble burst in 1991, the economy flatlined. The private sector, companies and households, stopped spending and started paying down debt. To keep the country from falling into a deflationary depression, the Japanese government stepped in as the borrower of last resort. They spent to keep people employed. They built infrastructure projects of questionable utility. They subsidized industries. Then, demographic reality set in. The population started aging, rapidly. Today, social security and healthcare costs are devouring the budget. The government borrows to pay pensions, and it borrows to pay the interest on the money it borrowed to pay previous pensions. In 2013, public debt exceeded 1 quadrillion yen, a number so large it loses meaning. By 2025, general gross debt reached 1.324 trillion yen. Any other country with this balance sheet would have faced a currency collapse or a sovereign default. Bond vigilantes would have shorted the currency, driven interest rates to 20%, and forced the government to slash spending or print money until the currency became worthless. But in Japan, even after the historic policy pivot of 2024 ended the era of negative interest rates, the yield on the 10-year government bond, the JGB, has remained remarkably contained. The yen, while fluctuating, remains a global reserve currency. Why? How does a country that owes 235% of its GDP not collapse? The answer lies in a uniquely Japanese financial engineering feat known as the closed loop. This closed loop is the secret source of Japan's survival. It is an economic bunker designed to withstand the pressures of debt. Unlike the United States, which relies on China, Saudi Arabia, and Europe to buy a significant portion of its debt, Japan's debt is owned by the Japanese. As of late 2024, nearly 90% of Japanese government bonds, JGBs, were held domestically. The foreign ownership ratio is roughly 12 to 14%, compared to 30 to 35% for the US and 50 to 55% for Germany. This means Japan does not rely on the kindness of strangers. It relies on the thrift of its own people. The largest holder of this debt is the Bank of Japan, BOJ itself, which owns nearly half of the entire market, over 522 trillion yen worth. The BOJ prints money to buy bonds, keeping interest rates artificially low. The second biggest block of holders? Domestic banks, insurance companies, and pension funds. The mechanism works like this. The Japanese grandmother, historically risk-averse after seeing asset values crumble in the 90s, saves her money in a low-interest savings account. A primary destination for these savings has historically been the Japan Post Bank. The Japan Post Bank takes that deposit and, mandated by a mix of regulation, tradition, and a lack of better lending opportunities, buys Japanese government bonds. The government takes that money and pays the grandmother's pension. We cannot overstate the role of the Japan Post Bank in this machine, though its function has mutated in dangerous ways. Historically, this institution wasn't just a place to mail a letter. It was a financial titan, standing for decades as the world's largest savings bank by deposits. Established in 1875, it was designed to fund the government's bullet trains and highways. But in the desperate search for yield during the lost decades, this loyal servant went rogue. Japan Post Bank stopped simply buying low-yielding Japanese bonds and began aggressively moving into foreign securities, US treasuries, and complex credit instruments. It transformed from a domestic stabilizer into a massive conduit that siphons household savings out of Japan and into global markets. The grandmother's yen isn't just paving roads in Osaka anymore. It's funding mortgages in Texas, leaving the domestic closed loop far more porous and the yen far more vulnerable than the government would like to admit. So, the state is broke in the sense that it has massive liabilities. But it is rich in trust and domestic capital. It has socialized the costs of the bubble burst and an aging society, absorbing the shock into the national balance sheet so that households didn't have to face austerity. The Japanese people are effectively lending money to themselves to maintain their standard of living. While the government drowns in red ink, the aggregate Japanese household appears to be a fortress of solvency. By 2024, household financial assets hit a record high, exceeding 2.2 quadrillion yen. But if we look closer, this is not a story of universal wealth. It is a story of geriatric hoarding. The mountain of cash is overwhelmingly held by retirees who lived through the boom years. The working-age population, meanwhile, is being squeezed by rising taxes to fund their parents' pensions. Japan isn't a country of rich citizens. It's a country of rich grandparents and struggling grandchildren. Why do Japanese households hoard cash? It is a rational response to the lost decades. After the 1990s bubble burst, stock and land prices collapsed and essentially flatlined for 30 years. A generation of savers learned that the stock market is a casino where you lose, and real estate is a depreciating asset. Furthermore, in a deflationary environment, which Japan experienced for most of this period, cash becomes more valuable over time just by sitting under a mattress. Prices go down, so your purchasing power goes up. This immense pool of private savings is the collateral that backs the Japanese state. The government can run deficits because the private sector runs massive surpluses. The broke government is effectively subletting the balance sheet of its rich citizens. However, this safety comes at a steep cost: stagnation. Cash implies a defensive crouch, a preparation for decline. This is why the government launched the new NISA program, a tax-exempt scheme designed to lure those quadrillions of yen out of cold storage and into the stock market. They hoped to revitalize the domestic economy. Instead, they accidentally triggered an exodus. When Japanese households finally woke up to inflation in 2024, they didn't buy shares in Toyota or Sony. They bought shares in Nvidia and Microsoft. The NISA program became a massive government-sanctioned pipeline for capital flight, allowing grandmothers and young professionals alike to sell yen and buy dollars tax-free. The closed loop didn't just leak, it burst open, draining domestic capital to fund the American boom while the yen crumbled. If the Japanese government is the sponge and the Korean household is the engine, what are the corporations doing? Here, the mirror image continues, but with a twist that explains why wages in both countries are stagnant for very different reasons. In Japan, the closed loop of low interest rates has created a phenomenon known as the zombie company. Because money is virtually free, banks, often pressured by the government to maintain employment, keep lending to inefficient, dying companies that, in a normal capitalist economy, would have gone bankrupt years ago. Walk through the back streets of Osaka or the industrial wards of Tokyo, and you will find thousands of small manufacturers, struggling retailers, and legacy construction firms that are barely breaking even. They are the living dead of the economy. They don't grow, they don't innovate, and crucially, they don't raise wages. But they don't die. They hoard labor, keeping unemployment miraculously low, around 2.5%, but they trap capital in unproductive sectors. Japan chose stability over creative destruction. The result is a comfortable, low unemployment stagnation where nobody gets fired, but nobody gets a raise. Cross the strait to Korea and the landscape changes violently, but do not mistake dynamism for health. The myth is that Korea is a land of pure survival of the fittest, but the reality is a brutal, dual economy. While there are indeed predators, the massive chaebols like Samsung, Hyundai, and SK that generate revenue equivalent to nearly 60% of GDP, there are also zombies hiding in their shadow. In fact, nearly 1 in 5 Korean companies is a marginal firm, unable to cover its interest payments. But unlike Japan, where zombies are kept alive by a gentle, socialized life support system, Korean zombies survive by neglected stagnation. The chaebols suck up the capital and talent, leaving the SMEs, which employ 80% of the population, to fight for scraps. This isn't a predator-free ecosystem. It's a kingdom where the predators are so big, they starve everything else. This corporate structure feeds directly back into the household debt crisis. Why are Korean parents willing to go into massive debt for private education? Why do they leverage themselves to live in the right school district? Because getting their child into a chaebol is the only escape hatch from the SME struggling class. In Japan, the corporate sector acts as a social safety net. In Korea, it acts as a tournament bracket. Now, let's cross the strait to South Korea. If Japan is the cautionary tale of government excess and stagnation, Korea was supposed to be the model student of fiscal discipline and dynamic growth. But this model was forged in the fire of national humiliation. The trauma of 1997 defines modern Korea. When the Asian financial crisis hit, Korea ran out of foreign reserves. The country was effectively bankrupt. The IMF stepped in with a bailout package that came with humiliating conditions: mass layoffs, brutal corporate restructuring, and austerity. The national shame was so deep that millions of citizens lined up to donate their own gold jewelry to help pay off the national debt. The lesson was seared into the national consciousness. Debt makes you a slave. The government must never be vulnerable again. For the next 2 decades, the Korean government maintained a pristine balance sheet. Even today, its government debt-to-GDP ratio is around 50%, a fraction of Japan's 235% and lower than almost any other major developed economy. But economic growth requires leverage. You cannot build high-rises, semiconductor plants, and a world-class consumer economy without borrowing money. If the government isn't borrowing to fuel growth, someone else has to. In Korea, that burden fell squarely on the households. While the Korean government stayed lean, Korean families gorged on debt. South Korea now has one of the highest household debt-to-GDP ratios in the world, hovering near 92% as of late 2024 and early 2025. This ranking is alarming. South Korea consistently places in the top tier of global household leverage, rubbing shoulders with the likes of Switzerland, Australia, and Canada, and sitting well above the United States. But to call this debt in the traditional Western sense misses the most fascinating and dangerous part of the Korean economy. Much of this debt isn't just credit card spending or traditional mortgages held by banks. It is tied to a system that exists almost nowhere else on Earth. A system with roots in the late 19th century that was supercharged by the rapid industrialization of the 1970s. A system called Jeonse. In most of the world, you rent an apartment by paying a monthly fee. In Korea, you have another option. You can pay a massive lump sum deposit, typically 50% to 80% of the property's market value, up front. In exchange, you live rent-free for 2 years. When you move out, the landlord gives you the entire principal back. Ideally, the landlord takes this massive interest-free loan and puts it in a savings account, keeping the interest as profit. The tenant gets free housing, only losing the opportunity cost of their cash. It seems like a win-win. But in reality, landlords don't put that money in a savings account. They use it to buy more houses. This created a phenomenon called gap investment. If a house costs 500 million won, and the Jeonse price is 400 million won, a landlord can buy that house with only 100 million won of their own money. The tenant effectively finances 80% of the purchase. The landlord controls the asset with 5 times leverage. During the years of low interest rates and rising property prices, this was a magic money machine. Landlords used tenant deposits to buy more houses, which brought in more deposits to buy more houses. Tenants, desperate to avoid monthly rent, took out cheap bank loans to pay the massive deposits because the interest on the loan was cheaper than paying monthly rent. This system turned the entire housing market into a massive, privately funded leverage scheme. Every landlord became a hedge fund. Every tenant became a lender. And like all leverage schemes, it worked beautifully, as long as prices went up. But markets do not go up forever. In 2022 and 2023, global interest rates spiked. The Jeonse machine jammed. Property prices fell. Suddenly, the gap widened. Landlords who had bought dozens or even hundreds of properties found that the market value of their homes was lower than the deposits they owed back to their tenants. This is known as reverse Jeonse, or negative equity. When the 2-year lease ended and the tenant asked for their $400,000 back, the landlord didn't have it. The money was tied up in the house, which was now worth only $350,000. This triggered the Villa King scandals, a series of catastrophic frauds that exposed the rot at the core of the system. One landlord, dubbed the Villa King, owned over 1,100 units in Seoul. He had leveraged tenant deposits to build a property empire worth billions of won, but he had also accumulated a massive bill in unpaid comprehensive real estate taxes. When he died suddenly in 2022, the trap snapped shut. Because he had no assets other than debt, his heirs refused to inherit his estate. This left tenants in a legal nightmare. They couldn't cancel their leases with a dead man to trigger their insurance, and when the properties were finally auctioned, the Korean government took its unpaid taxes first, leaving the tenants with nothing but dust. The human cost was devastating. Victims, many of them newlyweds or young professionals in their 20s and 30s, faced financial ruin. Tragically, several victims took their own lives, leaving notes despairing over the loss of their future. This is why the Korean people feel broke, even if their country is rich. Their wealth is structurally different from the Japanese. In Japan, wealth is cash in the bank, boring, low yield, but safe. In Korea, nearly 65% of household wealth is tied up in non-financial assets, primarily real estate. In Japan, a property crash hurts the banks and the government. In Korea, a property crash hurts the individual tenant immediately and catastrophically. The Korean middle class is house poor, sitting on expensive assets that they can't sell, paying interest on massive loans, and living in fear that their deposit might vanish into thin air. So we have the Japanese model: socialized risk, high public debt, liquid citizens, low growth. And the Korean model: privatized risk, low public debt, leveraged citizens, high dynamism, but high anxiety. History, however, rarely stays static. As we look at the data from 2024 and 2025, we are seeing a strange, dysfunctional convergence. Japan is realizing that its closed loop is suffocating, but its attempt to open the window has backfired. The government aggressively pushed households into the new NISA investment accounts to wake up their sleeping cash. The Japanese people responded by waking up and immediately moving their money abroad. In a massive wave of capital flight, Japanese households sold yen to buy US stocks, inadvertently crashing their own currency. The government tried to financialize its citizens to save the economy, but the citizens are using that freedom to exit the Japanese system entirely. Meanwhile, Korea is realizing that privatized risk is a political time bomb. The government is being forced to intervene in the imploding Jeonse market, effectively nationalizing the private debts of landlords to prevent mass homelessness. The state is buying up Villa King properties and offering bailout loans, slowly turning the government's pristine balance sheet into a dumping ground for the private sector's leverage. The Korean government is becoming more indebted to save its people. The Japanese people are abandoning their currency to save their savings. The mirror is cracking. The story of Japan and Korea is a lesson in the conservation of risk. You cannot destroy economic risk. You can only move it around. As we move deeper into the 2020s, both nations are finding the limits of their respective models. Japan can no longer afford to be so safe. Korea can no longer afford to be so risky. The rich government and the rich citizens are both finding out that, in the end, the bill always comes due.